the quiet village of Klingenberg, Germany, the tragic story of a young woman would go on to spark one of the most controversial debates in modern history, a debate that continues to polarize opinions nearly 5 decades later. Anneliese Michel, a devout Catholic girl born in 1952, lived a life marked not only by deep faith but also by overwhelming torment, first from medical afflictions and later by what she and her family believed to be demonic possession. Her death in 1976, following months of exorcisms sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church, raised painful questions about the boundaries between religion and medicine, spiritual belief and psychological illness, and ultimately life and death. This video delves into the life and legacy of Anneliese Michel, known to many through the fictionalized portrayal in The Exorcism of Emily Rose, with the goal of understanding the layers of complexity that defined her suffering. More than a tale of possession, Anneliese's story represents the intersection of science, spirituality, and ethics. It forces society to confront unsettling truths about how we respond to mental illness, religious conviction, and authority. What led a young woman with known neurological and psychological diagnoses to reject medical treatment in favor of spiritual rituals that would ultimately contribute to her demise? Were her experiences truly supernatural, or were they tragic manifestations of untreated mental illness compounded by religious suggestion? What role did her family, her priests, and even the church itself play in shaping the outcome of her fate? By examining her early life, the onset of symptoms, the exhaustive exorcism rituals, and the high-profile court case that followed her death, this video seeks not just to tell Anneliese Michel's story, but to explore its implications. It analyzes the psychological, religious, and legal elements that collided in one of history's most widely studied exorcism cases, and considers the lasting cultural, theological, and cinematic impact her cases had around the world. Anneliese Michel was born on September 21, 1952, in the small town of Liebelfing in Bavaria, West Germany. Raised in a devout Roman Catholic household, Anneliese was the second of 4 daughters born to Joseph and Anna Michel. Her family life was shaped by strict religious values, a commitment to traditional German Catholicism, and a deep sense of spiritual duty that would later influence how her suffering was interpreted by herself and those around her. Anneliese's mother Anna had given birth to a child out of wedlock prior to marrying Joseph, a fact that haunted her deeply and reinforced her piety and need for spiritual purity. Anna reportedly viewed Anneliese as a kind of atonement for her past sin and raised her with rigid expectations around morality and faith. This backdrop of guilt, religious devotion, and repressed emotion likely contributed to the spiritual lens through which Anneliese's later experiences were understood. During her early years, Anneliese was known to be friendly, intelligent, and devout. She performed well in school and was socially active, participating in church activities and developing strong bonds with her peers. Her teachers and classmates described her as kind-hearted and highly religious, with a strong desire to please others. She reportedly attended Mass twice a week and recited the Rosary daily. Her spiritual commitment, while admirable, may also have fostered a sense of pressure and perfectionism, traits commonly associated with scrupulosity, a form of religious obsessive-compulsive disorder. At age 16, Anneliese's life took a dramatic turn. In 1968, she experienced her first major health crisis, a seizure that resulted in a diagnosis of temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder that affects the part of the brain responsible for processing emotion and memory. This condition can produce symptoms such as hallucinations, intense fear, altered consciousness, and religious visions, symptoms that would later mirror the behaviors observed during her alleged possession. Following her initial diagnosis, Anneliese was placed on anti-epileptic medication, including Dilantin and Lategretol, though her seizures persisted. In addition to the seizures, she began to experience deep depressive episodes, visual hallucinations, and auditory disturbances. She reported seeing devil faces and hearing voices telling her she was damned. These symptoms led to further medical consultations, during which she was also diagnosed with depression and treated at a psychiatric clinic. Despite the interventions, her condition continued to deteriorate, baffling her doctors and intensifying her family's distress. It is during this period that Anneliese's deeply held religious beliefs began to shape her interpretation of her suffering. Rather than viewing her condition strictly as a medical issue, she began to believe that she was being punished for the sins of others, particularly the youth of the 1970s, whom she viewed as morally corrupt. Her religious delusions deepened, and she became convinced that her body was being overtaken by demonic forces. She began rejecting holy objects, lashing out during prayer, and displaying signs of intense agitation during religious rituals, classic indicators, in the view of her family and local clergy, of demonic possession. Despite continued psychiatric treatment, the Michel family grew increasingly convinced that Anneliese's affliction could not be explained by science alone. Their deeply Catholic worldview, coupled with Anneliese's own belief that she was possessed, set the stage for their desperate appeal to the church for an exorcism. Thus began the tragic transition from medical intervention to spiritual warfare, a shift that would ultimately cost Anneliese her life and ignite a national controversy. Anneliese, Michel's descent into what would later be interpreted as demonic possession, did not happen overnight. Her condition developed gradually, beginning with subtle neurological symptoms and evolving into a complex and terrifying combination of psychological, spiritual, and physical distress. These early manifestations were the first indicators of an internal battle that would eventually spiral into tragedy. Understanding the onset of her symptoms is crucial to evaluating both the medical and spiritual interpretations that defined her case. The first major turning point occurred in 1968, when Anneliese was just 16 years old. While at school, she suffered a sudden convulsive seizure, an event that prompted immediate medical attention. She was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Würzburg, where doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE, a condition affecting the temporal lobes of the brain, which are responsible for processing emotions and memory. Individuals with TLE often experience a wide range of symptoms, including complex partial seizures, déjà vu, hallucinations, both auditory and visual, intense emotions like fear or euphoria, and religious or mystical experiences. To manage her condition, Anneliese was prescribed Dilantin, phenytoin, a common anticonvulsant medication. Despite the medication, her seizures persisted. More concerning, however, were the psychological symptoms that began to emerge. She reported episodes of paralysis, blackouts, and losing control of her body. At times, she was unable to speak or move. While these may have been dissociative or seizure-related events, they took on spiritual meaning for Anneliese, especially given her religious upbringing. In addition to her seizures, Anneliese began to exhibit symptoms consistent with major depressive disorder. She became withdrawn, lost interest in daily activities, and began to express feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. Her family noticed marked changes in her personality. Once cheerful and social, she grew increasingly isolated and sullen. Her academic performance declined, and she appeared emotionally flat or intensely anxious. At one point, she even expressed a desire to die and stated that she felt possessed by something evil. In 1970, her condition escalated dramatically. While in a psychiatric hospital in Middelburg, she suffered another violent seizure, during which she bit her tongue severely. She became unable to control her body and described seeing images of terrifying disfigured faces, what she later identified as demonic figures. These experiences further alienated her from medical professionals who viewed her symptoms as hallucinatory or psychotic. She was prescribed additional medication, including Tegretol, carbamazepine, a stronger anticonvulsant with mood-stabilizing properties. Still, her hallucinations and delusions intensified. Although doctors diagnosed Anneliese with temporal lobe epilepsy and psychosis, her family, and eventually Anneliese herself, began to view the experiences through a spiritual lens. The Michel family's devout Catholicism framed their understanding of her condition. The hallucinations were not seen as neurological misfires, but as spiritual intrusions. Her mother, Anna in particular, interpreted the symptoms as signs of possession, especially when Anneliese began to speak in harsh, guttural voices, reject sacred objects like crucifixes, and claim she was tormented by invisible forces. The religious overtones in Anneliese's delusions only strengthened this interpretation. She began insisting that she was damned and beyond salvation, despite being a devout believer. She would fall into deep trances, growl, and scream for hours without provocation. Her episodes included compulsive self-injury and striking out at others. She began sleeping on the floor, refusing food and water for days at a time, and obsessively performing acts of penance. These behaviors deeply disturbed her family, who now believed that medical science could no longer help her. Despite the growing belief in supernatural causes, Anneliese and her family continued to consult doctors and psychiatrists throughout 1972 and 1973. Electroencephalograms, EEGs, conducted during this time showed abnormal electrical activity in the brain, consistent with epilepsy. Yet none of the treatments were successful in eliminating her symptoms. In fact, her mental and physical state worsened under medical care. She experienced weight loss, open sores from compulsive kneeling, and self-harm, and the continued presence of auditory hallucinations. Some psychiatrists noted that Anneliese may have suffered from schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, though this diagnosis was never formally confirmed. Others suggested that her religious background and guilt-based beliefs could be contributing to a condition known as religious psychosis, a form of delusional thinking heavily influenced by spiritual ideology. However, these theories were never fully explored, and the medications she was prescribed had little effect on her behavior. By late 1973, Anneliese began rejecting medical help altogether. She and her family came to believe that her affliction was not psychological or neurological, but spiritual in origin. Her symptoms, they felt, aligned more closely with classical signs of demonic possession described in Catholic doctrine: aversion to sacred objects, unnatural strength, speaking in unknown languages, and knowledge of things she could not have known. At this point, the family began petitioning the Catholic Church for an exorcism. After repeated denials from local clergy, who insisted she needed continued medical care, Father Ernst Alt, a sympathetic priest, declared Anneliese to be possessed and urged the bishop to approve the ancient rite of exorcism. By September 1975, Bishop Joseph Stungel gave formal permission, setting in motion the events that would lead to the now infamous 67 sessions of exorcism over the following 10 months. The decision to seek an exorcism for Anneliese Michel did not occur impulsively. It emerged after years of mounting desperation, failed medical interventions, and intensifying symptoms that defied conventional psychiatric explanation. For the Michel family, particularly Anneliese and her mother Anna, there was no longer any doubt. This was not an illness of the body or mind, but of the soul. The involvement of the Catholic Church and the events that followed would become one of the most controversial and tragic episodes in the Church's modern history. Exorcism is not taken lightly within the Catholic Church. By the 1970s, formal exorcisms were rare in Germany. The Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965, had shifted the Church's emphasis away from rituals perceived as outdated or superstitious, and exorcisms, particularly the Rituale Romanum, the centuries-old rite used to cast out demons, were now reserved for extreme and well-documented cases. Most dioceses discouraged its use, emphasizing psychiatric treatment instead. When Anneliese and her family first sought help from local clergy, their requests were rejected multiple times. Priests advised the family to continue medical care and therapy, noting that Anneliese's symptoms, despite their disturbing nature, fell under the domain of mental illness. Some even warned that belief in possession could worsen her psychological condition. However, one priest, Father Ernst Alt, was different. Father Alt was moved by Anneliese's suffering and deeply convinced that her symptoms could not be explained through medicine alone. He later wrote to Bishop Joseph Stungel of Würzburg, stating, "She doesn't look epileptic in the slightest. I do not observe any seizures. I believe this is a case of possession." Father Alt began visiting the Michel household regularly and kept detailed records of her behaviors. He reported seeing her kneel for hours in frenzied prayer, speak in guttural voices, and display knowledge of things she had no way of knowing, such as personal sins committed by people around her. He noted her violent aversion to religious symbols and her deterioration in both physical health and psychological state. After persistent appeals from Father Alt, Bishop Joseph Stungel finally granted permission for an exorcism under the rite of exorcism from the Rituale Romanum of 1614, the Church's official guidelines for dealing with demonic possession. The exorcism was to be conducted in secrecy to avoid media scrutiny and public fear. Note: the task was assigned to Father Arnold Renz, an experienced priest familiar with the ritual. Together with Father Alt, Renz began the first of 67 exorcism sessions on September 24, 1975. These sessions continued, often weekly and later multiple times per week, until June 30th, 1976, the day before Anneliese and Michel died. Each exorcism session lasted several hours and followed a strict liturgical formula. The priests invoked the name of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the archangels, and commanded the demons to leave the afflicted body. They sprinkled holy water, held crucifixes, recited Latin prayers, and used sacred relics. The sessions were intense and grueling, often involving physical restraint. Many of the sessions were audio recorded by the priests and family members. These tapes, later used as evidence in court, are some of the only known recordings of an exorcism in modern Catholic history. In the recordings, Anneliese's voice shifts dramatically, at times low and growling, at others shrill and maniacal. She screams blasphemies, curses the priests, mocks prayers, and identifies herself as multiple entities. According to Anneliese and the exorcists, the demons possessing her included Lucifer the leader, who claimed authority over the others, Judas Iscariot, the betrayer of Christ, Nero, the Roman emperor and persecutor of Christians, Cain, the first murderer, Adolf Hitler, whose presence reflected historical evil, Fleischmann, a disgraced 16th century Frankish priest. Each of these entities reportedly spoke through her, arguing with each other and resisting the priest's commands. At times, Anneliese would switch voices mid-sentence or speak in archaic or unknown languages. She also demonstrated extreme physical behaviors, including she bit herself, headbutted walls, and tore at her clothing. She believed it would weaken the demons. She prayed obsessively, sometimes for days without rest. The priest and her family reported that she could throw off multiple people restraining her. Throughout the exorcism process, Anneliese's health deteriorated rapidly. She grew gaunt and emaciated with bruises, lesions, and broken bones. By May 1976, she weighed less than 40 kilograms, around 88 pounds, and was no longer able to walk or speak clearly. Her knees were shattered from repeatedly genuflecting hundreds of times per day. She reportedly performed over 600 genuflections during a single session. Her face became sunken, her voice hoarse and broken. Despite this, she continued to insist on the need for more exorcisms. Her belief that she was suffering for the sins of others had become central to her identity. It is important to note that at no point during these months was medical assistance re-engaged. The family and priest believed that the medications had failed and that returning to psychiatric care would only prolong her suffering. Her parents stopped feeding her by force when she refused to eat, believing that it was part of her spiritual atonement. This decision would later play a central role in the legal case against them. By late June 1976, it was clear to all involved that Anneliese was near death. She had developed pneumonia, was severely dehydrated, and weighed just 30 kilograms, 66 pounds. Yet she reportedly told Father Renz, "Beg for absolution, I am afraid." The final exorcism session took place on June 30th, 1976. That night, Anneliese made her last confession and asked her mother to stay with her. On the morning of July 1st, 1976, she died in her bed. The official cause of death was determined to be malnutrition and dehydration, brought on by prolonged starvation and exhaustion. By the summer of 1976, Anneliese Michel was a shadow of her former self. After nearly a year of exorcism sessions, some lasting for 4 hours or more, she was physically, mentally, and spiritually depleted, weighing barely 68 pounds, 30 kilograms, and suffering from a combination of malnutrition, severe dehydration, bed sores, broken knees, and a likely immune system collapse. She could no longer perform even basic functions. She had stopped eating voluntarily, and her family, believing her fasting was divinely inspired and necessary for the exorcism, did not force food or medical attention upon her. Her condition had grown so critical by late June that she could no longer speak above a whisper. She had developed a high fever, her eyes were sunken, and her limbs were bruised and stiff from repeated falls and self-inflicted injuries. Despite her worsening condition, Anneliese insisted that she continue the exorcisms. Her final recorded words on June 30th were chilling. "Beg for absolution. Mother, stay with me. I'm afraid." At approximately 8 a.m. on July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel was found dead in her bed. She had finally succumbed to the physical stress inflicted on her body after months of torment. Her death was quiet, ending a long and harrowing journey that had captured the desperation of her family, the rigid doctrines of faith, and the tragic shortcomings of both religion and medicine. The public initially had no knowledge of the events leading up to Anneliese's death. It wasn't until 2 days later, when her body was formally examined, that her condition shocked authorities. The autopsy was conducted by Dr. Siegfried Gutjahr, a forensic pathologist, who concluded that she had died due to malnutrition, dehydration, prolonged fasting, pneumonia, induced by weakened immunity and possible aspiration, exhaustion and stress from physical trauma. Her body showed clear signs of abuse, not in the sense of intentional physical violence, but from repeated trauma during exorcism rituals and self-harm. Both knees were shattered due to repeated genuflections. Bruises, lacerations, and sores covered her limbs. Her mouth was severely injured, likely from biting herself during episodes. Her internal organs showed signs of starvation, with nearly all fat reserves gone. Dr. Gutjahr reported that her death was entirely preventable, had she received medical treatment and been fed and hydrated properly. The findings were damning, not just for her parents and the priests, but for the church's secret involvement in the ordeal. With growing media attention and legal concern, the case rapidly escalated. Yet, the Bavarian state took swift legal action. In 1978, the state prosecutor charged Anneliese's parents, Josef and Anna Michel, and the two priests, Father Ernst Alt and Father Arnold Renz, with negligent homicide. The trial began in March 1978 in Aschaffenburg, West Germany, and was closely followed by both national and international press. It was quickly dubbed the exorcism trial and drew massive public interest due to its implications for law, religion, and mental health. The prosecution argued that Anneliese's condition was clearly medical, not spiritual. Her parents and the priests had knowingly denied her essential medical care, including food and fluids. The exorcisms, while legal under religious freedom, were administered irresponsibly without medical supervision. Medical experts testified that all signs pointed to schizophrenia, psychosis, or temporal lobe epilepsy, and that exorcism rituals had replaced proper treatment. They argued that the psychosomatic influence of her religious beliefs, coupled with the intense reinforcement from her family and the priests, had made her a victim of spiritual delusion, a condition known today as religious or spiritual psychosis. However, the defense's argument was far more nuanced. They contended Anneliese voluntarily refused medical care in the last months of her life. The parents were acting in accordance with their faith and with the guidance of the church. The priests believed they were performing their duty as spiritual caregivers, not healthcare providers. The church had approved the exorcism, giving them moral and institutional authority. The court was shown audio recordings from the exorcisms, grim evidence of the ordeal. In them, Anneliese can be heard growling, screaming in multiple voices, and naming demons like Lucifer and Judas. These recordings deeply disturbed both the jury and the public, painting a picture of torment, but also raising questions about how such behavior could be fabricated or staged by a physically weakened girl. In the end, the court reached a compromise. All 4 defendants were found guilty of manslaughter resulting from negligence, but due to the unusual nature of the case, the court showed leniency. The priests were sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended for 3 years. Joseph and Anna Michel were spared jail time altogether, with the court reasoning that they had suffered enough. The case polarized German society and beyond. In conservative Catholic communities, many saw Anneliese as a martyr who died in the service of God, suffering for the sins of the modern world. Others condemned the case as a horrifying example of religious fundamentalism and medical neglect. The Catholic Church, under intense scrutiny, remained mostly silent. Though the local bishop had approved the exorcism, the church issued no public apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, it quietly began revising its protocols. In 1999, the Vatican issued an updated rite of exorcism, discouraging its use without psychiatric consultation and placing greater emphasis on scientific explanations for unusual behavior. In 1984, at the request of her parents and several believers who claimed Anneliese's body had not decomposed naturally, a supposed sign of sainthood, her remains were exhumed and reburied in a new oak coffin. Though no official statement was made about the condition of her body, eyewitnesses reported it had decomposed normally, dispelling rumors of incorruption. Despite this, her grave in Klingenberg in Maine became a site of pilgrimage. To this day, believers visit to leave flowers, rosaries, and letters, often referring to her as a suffering servant or an intercessor for the possessed. The Church has never sanctioned or promoted these claims, but it has not disavowed them either. The case of Anneliese Michel has inspired books, documentaries, academic studies, and multiple films, most notably The Exorcism of Emily Rose, 2005, which blended courtroom drama with horror to tell a fictionalized version of the case. While it reintroduced the debate about faith and medicine to a new generation, critics warn that such portrayals often sensationalize suffering and distort the psychological realities of possession-like symptoms. In psychological circles, Anneliese's case is now often cited in discussions on dissociative identity disorder, DID, religious psychosis, cultural-bound syndromes, the impact of group belief systems on mental health. For legal and ethical experts, it remains a case study in parental responsibility, religious freedom, and medical ethics. Could or should the state have intervened earlier? What is the boundary between respecting belief and preventing harm? For many, Anneliese Michel remains not just a tragic figure, but a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest uncertainties, the limits of science, the power of belief, and the dark places where the two collide. The case of Anneliese Michel has continued to intrigue and challenge professionals from both psychological and theological fields. Her tragic death after the exorcism rituals, which involved elements of psychological breakdown and religious fervor, has led to ongoing debates about the nature of possession, the responsibility of religious practices, and the role of medical intervention. From a psychological standpoint, the behaviors exhibited by Anneliese Michel align with several well-documented psychiatric conditions, which challenge the notion that she was possessed by demons. Many experts argue that her symptoms were more indicative of severe mental illness, most likely schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy, and dissociative identity disorder, DID, which could explain the manifestation of multiple personalities and the extreme behaviors associated with her exorcism. Schizophrenia is a mental illness characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and a distorted perception of reality. Anneliese's delusions, including her belief that she was possessed, her aversion to religious symbols, and her constant insistence on suffering for other sins, suggest that she may have experienced the paranoid subtype of schizophrenia. The intense religious delusions she had, such as claiming to be suffering on behalf of others, align with what is known as religious psychosis, a subtype where individuals develop a fixation on religious themes that are disconnected from reality. Anneliese's reports of hearing voices and seeing demons could have been auditory and visual hallucinations, common in schizophrenia. Her bizarre behaviors, speaking in strange voices, contorting her body, and engaging in self-mutilation, might reflect the disorganized symptoms of schizophrenia, where a person's thoughts, speech, and actions become fragmented and difficult to comprehend. One of the most compelling arguments for a medical condition being responsible for Anneliese's behaviors is the possibility of temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE, which can sometimes lead to seizure-like states that cause hallucinations, emotional outbursts, and religious or spiritual delusions. Anneliese's symptoms, including violent shaking, loss of consciousness, and rigid posturing, strongly suggest the possibility of TLE, a condition that can cause individuals to experience epileptic auras, sensory or emotional distortions prior to seizures. The temporal lobe is heavily involved in processing memory, emotion, and religious experiences, making it a critical factor when trying to understand Anneliese's intense religious experiences and the possession-like symptoms she exhibited. Research has shown that many people suffering from TLE report heightened spiritual experiences or mystical visions during their seizures, which may explain why Anneliese interpreted her condition as a battle with demonic forces. Another possible explanation for Anneliese's shifting identities, where she was believed to be possessed by several demons at once, might be dissociative identity disorder, DID, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. DID is a severe form of dissociation where an individual develops distinct identities or alters, often as a response to severe trauma. Anneliese's frequent switching between different voices and personalities might be understood through this lens. These switches could have been triggered by emotional stress and trauma related to her religious upbringing and psychological breakdown. The tendency to engage in self-harm, including biting herself, could reflect the self-punitive nature of DID, where individuals punish themselves for real or imagined sins or traumas they feel responsible for. From a theological perspective, the events surrounding Anneliese Michel were interpreted not as a medical crisis, but as a spiritual battle between the forces of good and evil. The Catholic Church's official stance on exorcism involves the belief in demonic possession as a form of spiritual affliction that can only be cured by faith and religious intervention. In this context, Anneliese's behaviors were seen as manifestations of demonic possession, and the exorcism was viewed as the only means of freeing her from these malevolent forces. The Catholic doctrine of possession holds that when an individual is taken over by demons, they may experience a loss of control over their thoughts and actions. The symptoms that Anneliese exhibited, speaking in foreign languages, convulsions, aversion to holy objects, and speaking in demonic voices, fit the classic signs of demonic possession according to Catholic teachings. In this framework, the Church's role is to intervene spiritually through the rite of exorcism to expel the demonic forces that have taken control of the individual. Anneliese's case, therefore, was perceived as a struggle between the divine, as embodied by the priests, and the forces of evil, the demons within her. The exorcists, Father Renz and Father Alt, believed that their role was not to provide physical care but to save her soul by driving out the demons, regardless of the toll it took on her physical health. The notion that Anneliese was suffering for the sins of others is rooted deeply in Catholic theology. The Catholic tradition places significant emphasis on the redemptive power of suffering, the idea that suffering in this life can purify the soul and serve as a form of atonement for sins. Anneliese believed that she was possessed because she had been chosen to endure torment as part of her spiritual mission. This belief aligns with the Catholic notion of redemptive suffering, where individuals may experience pain and torment as a means of atoning for the sins of the world. This interpretation presents Anneliese as a martyr, someone who chose to suffer in the name of God, furthering the belief that her exorcisms were not only necessary, but divinely inspired. For her parents, her suffering was a way to earn favor with God, and it was through this lens that they chose to reject conventional medicine in favor of spiritual healing. The tragedy of Anneliese Michel's death ultimately stems from the clash between faith and science, a tension that continues to shape discussions around religious belief and mental health. On one hand, the Catholic Church provided a framework for understanding Anneliese's symptoms as a spiritual battle, while on the other, modern medicine viewed her suffering as the result of a mental illness that required medical intervention. Had psychiatric treatment been pursued alongside spiritual care, it is possible that Anneliese could have received the help she needed to recover. Her tragic death highlights the dangers of ignoring medical advice in favor of religious convictions, as well as the dangers of medical practitioners who fail to acknowledge the deeply spiritual needs of certain individuals. The case remains an unresolved tension between the different ways that humans interpret suffering, belief, and the mind-body connection. The tragic story of Anneliese Michel continues to haunt the collective memory of society, not only because of the harrowing events that led to her death, but also due to the deep philosophical and ethical questions it raises about the intersection of faith, medicine, and human suffering. The case stands as a chilling reminder of the complexities involved in understanding mental health, the potential dangers of extreme religious beliefs, and the urgent need for compassion and proper intervention when individuals are in crisis. At the core of Anneliese Michel's story is the stark contrast between faith and reason. Her case illustrated how a person's belief system can dramatically shape the way they experience and interpret psychological distress. Anneliese's belief in possession, rooted deeply in her religious upbringing, created a framework in which her psychological breakdown was perceived as a spiritual crisis rather than a medical one. For Anneliese's parents and the two priests who performed the exorcisms, the faith-based approach was not only the most logical solution, but the only one they could accept in the face of her suffering. They believed that the physical and mental anguish she endured could only be alleviated through spiritual intervention. However, this decision tragically led to her death. While their intentions may have been grounded in devotion and love, they ultimately failed to consider the medical and psychological realities that Anneliese was facing. The rigidity of belief without a balanced approach proved to be fatal. On the other hand, the failure to intervene medically, especially when it became clear that Anneliese's condition was not improving and was likely deteriorating, illustrates the dangers of rejecting the scientific method and psychiatric care in favor of religious interpretations. The case brings into question the limits of religious freedom when a person's life is at risk, emphasizing the need for medical professionals to recognize and respect spiritual beliefs while simultaneously addressing mental health issues with urgency and care. Another significant lesson from Anneliese's case is the danger of isolation and medical neglect. When Anneliese stopped eating and drinking, she was essentially left alone to suffer by her parents. Despite the severity of her condition, her decline in health, marked by malnutrition, dehydration, and physical trauma, could have been mitigated if she had received proper medical care. But her parents, convinced that her suffering was part of a divine plan, refused to seek help from doctors. The case underscores the responsibility of caregivers, whether parents or religious leaders, to ensure the well-being of the individuals in their care. While they may have felt morally and spiritually obligated to carry out the exorcisms, they were obligated equally, if not more so, to ensure that Anneliese's basic physical needs were met. Healthcare professionals, too, must remain sensitive to the spiritual needs of their patients, while never losing sight of the importance of medical intervention in cases of serious illness or injury. In the end, Anneliese's story is a tragic example of what can happen when medical and religious boundaries collide without proper communication or understanding. The ethical implications of performing exorcisms also play a central role in this case. Exorcism is a deeply personal and religious practice that, when conducted responsibly and with proper care, can offer comfort to those who genuinely believe in the power of the ritual. However, Anneliese Michel's case raises serious ethical questions about the responsibility of religious leaders in cases of extreme psychological distress. The priests who carried out the exorcisms of Anneliese Michel did so under the assumption that she was truly possessed. However, in retrospect, they failed to acknowledge the possibility that mental illness might be at the root of her behavior. It is important to note that the Catholic Church itself has developed protocols over the years to ensure that exorcism is only performed in extreme cases where demonic possession is the most likely cause of the symptoms. The Church has increasingly advocated for psychological evaluations and psychiatric assessments before allowing an exorcism to proceed. This change in policy is one of the few positive outcomes of Anneliese's case, as it represents a broader recognition that the psychological and spiritual must be intertwined, especially in cases that challenge the boundaries of what is considered to be normal psychological behavior. The legacy of Anneliese Michel lies not just in the tragic circumstances of her death, but in the lessons that can be learned from her case. It has become a cautionary tale, urging both the religious and medical communities to adopt a more holistic approach to care. Religious leaders are now more encouraged to seek the counsel of medical professionals when dealing with individuals who exhibit symptoms that may be psychological rather than spiritual in nature. Likewise, psychiatrists and psychologists are learning to consider the cultural and spiritual dimensions of their patients' lives, offering a broader framework for understanding the complex nature of human distress. Moreover, Anneliese's story has sparked a larger conversation about the moral responsibility of those involved in cases of mental health crises and the role of religious and spiritual beliefs in shaping how individuals cope with such crises. Modern-day exorcisms continue to occur, albeit under much stricter guidelines, and the debate around the ethics of religious interventions persists. Anneliese Michel's story continues to influence the development of mental health protocols, the practice of exorcism, and the boundaries between religion and medicine. Ultimately, Anneliese's case brings into focus the universality of human suffering and the myriad ways in which people seek to explain and cope with pain. Whether through psychological intervention, spiritual healing, or a combination of both, the case forces us to confront the question of what constitutes genuine care for those who are vulnerable. It compels us to reflect on the nature of faith and how it can sometimes lead to blindness in the face of physical and emotional needs. In Anneliese's case, the overlap of spirituality and illness led to a tragic and irreversible outcome. But it also serves as a powerful reminder of the need for compassionate understanding, not only in terms of healthcare, but also in recognizing the dignity and worth of those who suffer, regardless of the form that suffering takes. Genuine care for those who are vulnerable. It compels us to reflect on the nature of faith and how it can sometimes lead to blindness in the face of physical and emotional needs. In Anneliese's case, the overlap of spirituality and illness led to a tragic and irreversible outcome. But it also serves as a powerful reminder of the need for compassionate understanding, not only in terms of healthcare, but also in recognizing the dignity and worth of those who suffer, regardless of the form that suffering takes.